The desert before El Alamein did not feel like the place where the Axis war effort would begin to collapse. For months, many German officers believed the North African campaign might still deliver a stunning victory. The sun rose over endless sand, the horizon trembling with heat, and somewhere beyond it lay Alexandria and the Suez Canal. If those fell, the British Empire would suffer one of the greatest strategic losses in its history. German soldiers of the Afrika Korps had already accomplished what many thought impossible. In early 1941, when they first arrived in Libya, the situation for the Axis seemed desperate. Italian forces had been pushed back by British troops and their armored divisions. Entire Italian armies had surrendered. But when German troops arrived under the command of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the war in the desert changed almost overnight. Rommel moved fast, faster than his enemies expected, and sometimes faster than his own supply lines could keep up. Within weeks, German armored units pushed the British back across hundreds of miles of desert. Tanks rolled through towns whose names would later become famous in military history: Mekelle, Derna, Tobruk. British commanders soon realized they were facing an opponent who thrived on speed and surprise. German officers began calling the campaign a war of maneuver. In Europe, armies moved across roads, forests, and cities. In North Africa, there was only open desert. No front line was ever permanent. A defensive position that existed in the morning could disappear by evening if tanks simply drove around it. Many German generals admired Rommel's aggressive style, though not all of them trusted it. Some worried that his constant attacks were pushing their forces deeper into enemy territory without secure supplies. Fuel, ammunition, and spare parts had to travel across the Mediterranean Sea, then hundreds of miles across desert roads that barely existed. Still, victory seemed close more than once. By mid-1942, Axis forces had pushed British troops all the way back into Egypt. Alexandria was only about 60 miles away. The Suez Canal, the vital artery of the British Empire, stood just beyond it. If the canal fell, Britain's connection to India, the Middle East, and much of Asia would be threatened. Inside German headquarters tents, maps spread across folding tables showed arrows pointing east toward Cairo. Officers spoke openly about the possibility that the British Army in Egypt might collapse completely. But the desert was also beginning to reveal a different reality. The further the Afrika Korps advanced, the longer their supply lines became. Ships carrying fuel and ammunition had to cross the Mediterranean while under constant threat from British aircraft, submarines, and warships. Every lost tanker meant dozens of tanks sitting silent in the sand. German generals began noticing a strange pattern. Victories on the battlefield were becoming harder to sustain. After every successful push forward, their fuel reserves dropped dangerously low. Sometimes armored units had to stop, not because of enemy fire, but because their engines simply ran dry. At the same time, the British were quietly rebuilding their strength. In the summer of 1942, a new commander arrived to lead the British Eighth Army. His name was Bernard Montgomery. Unlike previous British commanders in the desert, Montgomery had no intention of rushing into battle before his army was fully prepared. He studied the battlefield carefully. El Alamein was not just another point in the desert. It was one of the few places where the terrain itself limited movement. To the north lay the Mediterranean Sea. To the south stretched the vast Qattara Depression, a massive region of soft sand and salt marshes where tanks could not operate. Between those two natural barriers ran a narrow corridor only about 40 miles wide. For the first time in the North African campaign, it was impossible for armies to simply drive around each other through open desert. The German generals understood this immediately. If the British attacked here, there would be no easy escape routes, no sweeping flanking maneuvers across empty sand. Every tank, every artillery gun, every infantry position would have to face the enemy head-on. Rommel himself was not even present when preparations for the battle intensified. In September 1942, he had been forced to leave North Africa due to illness and exhaustion. The relentless desert campaign had taken a heavy toll on him. Command temporarily passed to General Georg Stumme. German intelligence officers reported that the British were building up enormous strength behind their lines. More tanks were arriving every week. New American-built Sherman tanks were appearing in British units, bringing heavier armor and stronger guns than many of the German machines facing them. There were also signs of something even worse worrying. British aircraft were dominating the skies more frequently. Supply convoys that once reached Axis ports were now being destroyed before they ever touched land. Fuel shortages became critical. Some German armored divisions had only enough fuel for a single day of heavy combat. Yet even as these problems grew, many German officers believed their defensive positions near El Alamein could hold. Minefields stretched across the desert in thick belts that soldiers nicknamed the Devil's Gardens. Thousands of anti-tank mines were buried beneath the sand. Artillery positions were carefully placed to cover every likely approach. From a distance, the front line looked quiet, but quiet in the desert was often an illusion. British reconnaissance aircraft constantly flew overhead, photographing every trench, every vehicle track, every artillery position. Engineers worked through the night building supply roads and stockpiling ammunition. By October 1942, the British Eighth Army had gathered a force unlike anything previously seen in the North African campaign. More than 190,000 soldiers stood ready. Hundreds of tanks waited behind the lines, and most important of all, more than 800 artillery guns had been positioned along the front. Many German officers did not yet realize what this meant. For months, battles in North Africa had been fought through quick armored clashes and sudden attacks. Artillery had always played a role, but nothing on the scale that was now being prepared. In the evening before the battle, the desert was unusually still. German soldiers sat in trenches, cleaning weapons, writing letters, or staring out across the sand. Some believed the British would launch another limited attack, like so many before. Others sensed something much larger was coming. In headquarters tents, maps spread across folding tables showed arrows pointing east toward Cairo. Officers spoke openly about the possibility that the British Army in Egypt might collapse completely. But the desert was also beginning to reveal a different reality. The further the Afrika Korps advanced, the longer their supply lines became. Ships carrying fuel and ammunition had to cross the Mediterranean while under constant threat from British aircraft, submarines, and warships. Every lost tanker meant dozens of tanks sitting silent in the sand. German generals began noticing a strange pattern. Victories on the battlefield were becoming harder to sustain. After every successful push forward, their fuel reserves dropped dangerously low. Sometimes armored units had to stop, not because of enemy fire, but because their engines simply ran dry. At the same time, the British were quietly rebuilding their strength. In the summer of 1942, a new commander arrived to lead the British Eighth Army. His name was Bernard Montgomery. Unlike previous British commanders in the desert, Montgomery had no intention of rushing into battle before his army was fully prepared. He studied the battlefield carefully. El Alamein was not just another point in the desert. It was one of the few places where the terrain itself limited movement. To the north lay the Mediterranean Sea. To the south stretched the vast Qattara Depression, a massive region of soft sand and salt marshes where tanks could not operate. Between those two natural barriers ran a narrow corridor only about 40 miles wide. For the first time in the North African campaign, it was impossible for armies to simply drive around each other through open desert. The German generals understood this immediately. If the British attacked here, there would be no easy escape routes, no sweeping flanking maneuvers across empty sand. Every tank, every artillery gun, every infantry position would have to face the enemy head-on. Rommel himself was not even present when preparations for the battle intensified. In September 1942, he had been forced to leave North Africa due to illness and exhaustion. The relentless desert campaign had taken a heavy toll on him. The desert was still burning from the artillery barrage when the next phase of the battle began. For hours, the night had been filled with explosions as more than 800 British guns fired across the Axis front line. German soldiers described the sky flashing constantly, as if lightning had taken over the desert. When the shelling finally began to slow, something even more dangerous followed. Through the dust and smoke, thousands of British infantry soldiers began moving forward. They advanced slowly and carefully into the minefields that protected the Axis defenses. Engineers crawled through the sand with metal detectors and bayonets, searching for buried mines. Behind them, other soldiers marked narrow, safe paths with white tape and lanterns so tanks could later follow. German defenders quickly realized what was happening. This was not a quick raid. It was the beginning of a massive breakthrough attempt. Machine guns opened fire into the darkness whenever movement was detected. Mortars began launching shells toward the advancing troops, but the British artillery continued firing in support, smashing many German positions before they could fully react. Inside Axis headquarters, confusion spread rapidly. At that moment, the overall commander in North Africa, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, was not even present. He was still in Germany, recovering from illness. Temporary command had been given to General George Stumm. Stumm tried to understand what kind of attack the British were launching. Reports from the front lines came in quickly, but many were incomplete. Telephone lines had been cut by the bombardment, and radio communication was chaotic. Some units reported heavy fighting in the minefields. Others said British tanks were already trying to move forward. In several areas, German defensive positions had been badly damaged by artillery fire. Early the next morning, Stumm decided to see the situation for himself. He drove toward the front with a small group of officers, hoping to observe the battle directly. But the battlefield had already become extremely dangerous. British artillery continued striking Axis positions, and fighting was spreading along the entire line. Then something unexpected happened. During this inspection near the front lines, General Stumm suddenly collapsed. According to several German officers, he likely suffered a heart attack under the intense stress of the battle. Within minutes, the acting commander of the Axis forces in North Africa was dead. The timing could not have been worse. The largest battle of the Desert War had just begun, and the army had suddenly lost its leader. Officers at headquarters rushed to reorganize the command structure while sending urgent messages back to Germany. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel was immediately informed that the British had launched a massive offensive and that Stumm had died. Rommel prepared to return to Africa as quickly as possible. But while he was still on his way, the battle continued to grow. British forces kept pushing through the minefields, slowly creating gaps in the Axis defenses. It was slow and dangerous work. Many soldiers were killed by mines or machine gun fire, but the British advance did not stop. German officers watching the situation began to notice something unusual. The British were not rushing their attack. In earlier desert battles, British armored divisions often charged forward quickly, sometimes suffering heavy losses against German anti-tank guns. Now their approach was different. They moved step by step, clearing mines, bringing forward artillery, and slowly increasing the pressure on the Axis line.
To many German generals, this method was worrying. It suggested the British were confident in their strength. They had more men, more artillery, and more tanks. Instead of gambling everything on a fast attack, they could afford to grind down the German defenses over time. For the Afrika Korps, time is exactly what they did not have. Fuel was already dangerously low. Replacement tanks were limited. Supply ships crossing the Mediterranean were constantly being attacked by British aircraft and submarines. Every day of heavy fighting drained the resources of the Axis army. And as the battle continued, German officers began to realize that this attack might be very different from anything they had faced in the desert before. This time, the British were not just trying to push them back, they were trying to destroy the Afrika Korps completely.
When Field Marshal Erwin Rommel finally returned to North Africa, the situation was already critical. The battle had been raging for several days, and the desert around El Alamein was covered with the wreckage of tanks, artillery pieces, and burned vehicles. Dust hung constantly in the air, mixed with smoke drifting from the front lines. Rommel arrived at headquarters and immediately began studying the maps. Reports from the front were troubling. British forces had not broken through yet, but they were pushing forward slowly, grinding through the Axis minefields and defensive positions. Every mile gained by the British had cost them heavily, but they had the resources to continue. The Afrika Korps did not. One of the first things Rommel asked about was fuel. The answer was grim. Several armored units had less than a day's supply left. Some tanks had already been abandoned because there was simply nothing left to run their engines. Trucks sat idle behind the lines, waiting for fuel convoys that might never arrive. The Desert War had always depended on logistics. Tanks, artillery, and vehicles consumed enormous amounts of fuel, and every drop had to cross the Mediterranean before traveling hundreds of miles across Libya. By late 1942, that supply route had become extremely dangerous. British aircraft and submarines were attacking Axis shipping constantly. Many fuel tankers had been sunk before reaching North Africa. The supplies that did arrive were often far below what Rommel needed to sustain a large battle. Rommel understood the reality immediately. His army was fighting a powerful enemy while slowly running out of the fuel needed to move, attack, or even retreat. Still, the defensive lines around El Alamein were strong. Minefields stretched across the desert in thick belts that soldiers had nicknamed the Devil's Gardens. Thousands of anti-tank mines were buried under the sand, forcing British forces to advance carefully and slowly. German anti-tank guns waited behind these minefields. These weapons had already proven deadly against Allied armor earlier in the Desert War. Well-hidden gun crews could destroy advancing tanks from long distances, sometimes stopping entire armored attacks. Rommel believed these defenses could still hold if the British offensive could be slowed. But the British commander, General Bernard Montgomery, had no intention of rushing the battle. Montgomery had spent weeks preparing his army for this moment. He had gathered enormous reserves of ammunition, tanks, and soldiers. More importantly, he had built a system that allowed his forces to keep attacking again and again. Every day, British artillery bombarded Axis positions. Fresh units rotated into the front lines, while exhausted troops moved back to rest. German officers noticed the difference immediately. The British army that they had fought earlier in the desert often launched fast armored assaults that could be stopped by strong defensive positions. But now their tactics were slower and more methodical. They attacked, paused, reorganized, and attacked again. It was a battle of endurance, and endurance was exactly what the Axis army lacked. Rommel walked through command posts speaking with his officers. Many of them were veterans who had fought with him since the early days of the Afrika Korps. They understood the desert and knew how dangerous the situation was becoming.
Several generals quietly expressed the same concern. Even if the British attacks could be stopped temporarily, the Axis army was slowly losing strength. Tanks destroyed in battle could not easily be replaced. Ammunition stocks were shrinking. Fuel shortages were growing worse every day. Yet far away in Germany, the expectations were very different. Messages from Adolf Hitler arrived at headquarters carrying a clear instruction. The line at El Alamein must not be abandoned. Hitler believed that retreat would cause the entire North African front to collapse. In his view, the army had to stand and fight no matter the cost. For Rommel, this created a dangerous dilemma. As a commander on the ground, he could see exactly what was happening. His army was outnumbered, undersupplied, and under constant pressure. The British had overwhelming artillery and air superiority. Every day of battle weakened the Axis position further. But the orders from Berlin were absolute: no retreat. Rommel discussed the situation with his senior officers late into the night. Maps were spread across tables as they calculated fuel supplies and possible defensive positions further west. Some officers believed they could still hold the line for a while longer. Others argued that waiting too long might trap the entire army. If the British broke through completely while the Axis army remained in place, escape routes across the desert could disappear very quickly. Rommel knew the danger. In the desert, mobility was everything. An army that could not move could easily be surrounded and destroyed. Yet for the moment, the order was clear. The line had to hold. So the fighting continued. British forces kept pushing slowly through the minefields. Artillery shells continued pounding defensive positions. Every day brought new losses on both sides. German soldiers fought with the experience and discipline that had made the Afrika Korps famous. Many positions were defended stubbornly, forcing British troops to advance yard by yard through dangerous ground. But as the days passed, one reality became harder to ignore. The British army seemed to grow stronger. Fresh tanks appeared on the battlefield. New infantry units arrived to replace casualties. Ammunition supplies seemed endless. For the German generals watching the battle unfold, the situation was becoming painfully clear. They were fighting an enemy who could afford to lose equipment and keep attacking. And the longer the battle lasted, the impossible their position would become.
By the third week of the battle, the situation for the Afrika Korps had become increasingly desperate. British forces had been methodically wearing down Axis defenses, clearing minefields and capturing trenches one by one. Every yard gained by the British brought them closer to breaking the defensive line completely. The desert around El Alamein was now littered with the twisted wreckage of tanks, burned-out trucks, and artillery pieces reduced to blackened metal. Smoke hung in the air, and the smell of cordite, burning diesel, and scorched earth was constant. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel knew that time was no longer on his side. Fuel was nearly gone for many armored units. Tanks that had been the backbone of his defensive strategy now sat immobilized in the sand. Ammunition was low, and replacement vehicles were scarce. Even the most disciplined units were exhausted after weeks of continuous bombardment and night attacks. Morale was holding, but only just. Despite this, Rommel remained determined to hold key positions. He understood that if the British broke completely through the front, the Axis army could be trapped between the Mediterranean Sea to the north and the Qattara Depression to the south, a natural barrier that would leave no room for maneuver. Every decision now carried enormous risk. By October 30th, the British launched Operation Supercharge, their decisive push to break the Axis line. Overhead, Hurricane and Spitfire squadrons flew constant patrols, strafing German positions and supply lines. Artillery fired relentlessly, pounding the Axis trenches, minefields, and anti-tank emplantments. Infantry and tanks advanced through the cleared gaps, moving methodically yet relentlessly. The scale of the operation overwhelmed the defenders.
German officers scrambled to organize their response. Some battalions held firm, using the defensive positions and well-hidden anti-tank guns to destroy advancing British armor. Entire platoons of Sherman and Churchill tanks were reduced to wrecks, their crews abandoned or captured. But for every unit destroyed, the British had more waiting behind the lines. They could absorb losses that would have ended any previous desert assault. Inside the Axis headquarters, tension was palpable. Generals debated what to do next. Some argued that holding every position was essential, that the minefields and natural terrain could slow the British enough to allow reinforcements or counterattacks. Others warned that staying put risked encirclement, and with fuel running out, retreat might be the only option to save the army from total destruction. Rommel weighed the options. He was no stranger to bold, aggressive counterattacks, but now the reality of dwindling resources and overwhelming enemy numbers made offense impossible. The British had not only strength, they had endurance. Montgomery's strategy relied on attrition, grinding down defenders over weeks, and Rommel knew that continued resistance without reserves or fuel could result in annihilation. Finally, Rommel made the decision to withdraw. The order was controversial. Berlin had demanded that no ground be abandoned, but on the ground, survival was paramount. Preserving the remaining forces was the only way to fight another day. Retreating now meant leaving behind heavy weapons, vehicles, and supplies. Soldiers abandoned what they could not carry, moving west along narrow desert corridors while under constant threat from artillery and air attacks. The retreat quickly became chaotic. Dust and smoke blended with the sound of gunfire and distant explosions. Convoys of trucks and half-tracks struggled to navigate the desert terrain. Tanks that could still move were prioritized, but many had to be abandoned. Engineers laid tracks and improvised roads where possible, but British artillery and aircraft struck repeatedly, adding to the chaos. During the retreat, German officers witnessed the effectiveness of the British plan firsthand. Montgomery's patience, coordination, and overwhelming firepower had created a battlefield where Axis tactics that had once succeeded in North Africa were now failing. Every defensive measure, every minefield, and every artillery emplantment had been anticipated, neutralized, or bypassed. The British had learned from previous defeats and applied those lessons meticulously. German soldiers fought bravely during the retreat, covering each other's movements and launching counterattacks when possible. Infantry crews manned anti-tank guns even as enemy tanks closed in. Machine gun nests provided covering fire for withdrawing units. Despite exhaustion, fear, and the desert heat, they delayed the British advance as long as possible. Yet the pressure was relentless. The British pushed forward steadily, and the Axis army lost both ground and equipment with each passing day. Supply shortages continued to limit mobility, and the wounded piled up, often abandoned on the battlefield. By early November, the Afrika Korps had retreated hundreds of miles of desert into Libya, leaving behind much of its heavy equipment but saving the core of its fighting force. The retreat marked a turning point in the North African campaign. El Alamein had been a decisive British victory, ending the Axis threat to Egypt and the Suez Canal. It shattered the myth of the invincible Afrika Korps and demonstrated the effectiveness of careful planning, overwhelming firepower, and strategic patience. For Rommel and his generals, the retreat was both a bitter lesson and a grim reality check. Courage and skill had not been enough. Even the desert fox, who had once seemed unstoppable, had to admit defeat. The desert had changed, and in war, even the most brilliant commanders must sometimes step back to survive.
By the time the dust settled over El Alamein, the battlefield had been transformed into a landscape of wreckage, smoke, and silence. Tanks lay abandoned, artillery pieces were twisted and burned, and trenches were filled with debris from weeks of bombardment. For the German generals, the retreat across the desert was not just a tactical withdrawal, it was a moment of reckoning. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel surveyed the remnants of his army with a mixture of frustration and resignation. He had fought some of the most daring campaigns in North Africa, but now the limits of logistics, resources, and enemy preparation were painfully clear. The British had achieved something that many had thought impossible. They had broken the Afrika Korps' defensive line, not through a sudden rush, but through patient, calculated attrition. German generals recorded their reactions and reflections in diaries and post-war memoirs. Many admitted that the British tactics at El Alamein had been both clever and relentless. Unlike previous battles in the desert where mobility and surprise could dominate, this time the British controlled every variable. Artillery, infantry, tanks, and air support worked together with precision. Even when a German position held, reinforcements were already arriving to continue the pressure. Rommel himself noted the professionalism of Montgomery's approach. Unlike earlier British commanders who had sometimes rushed attacks without proper preparation, Montgomery had learned from past mistakes. His forces advanced methodically, coordinating every assault with artillery barrages and minefield clearance, ensuring that every gain was secure. Rommel respected the skill and patience of his adversary, even as he faced the harsh consequences of defeat. Other generals reflected on the human cost of the battle. Thousands of Axis soldiers had been killed, wounded, or captured. Equipment lost in the desert could never be replaced quickly. Yet, despite the losses, the retreat had preserved the core of the Afrika Korps. Rommel emphasized that saving the army was crucial. It allowed German forces to continue fighting elsewhere in North Africa, delaying the complete collapse of Axis power in the region. Some officers admitted privately that the British had outmatched them in preparation, firepower, and endurance. They had underestimated the scale of the artillery bombardment and the ability of British engineers to clear minefields under fire. These realizations were a bitter pill, but they provided lessons for future engagements. El Alamein also left a mark on the wider Axis command. Hitler's insistence that the line must hold at all costs had placed enormous pressure on commanders in the field, forcing them into impossible decisions. Rommel's choice to retreat, though controversial, demonstrated that sometimes battlefield realities must override political demands. It was a moment that highlighted the tension between military judgment and ideological orders. For the British, the victory at El Alamein was celebrated as a turning point. Prime Minister Winston Churchill famously declared that before Alamein we never had a victory. After Alamein, we never had a defeat. The battle had not only stopped the Axis advance into Egypt, but had begun the long process of pushing German and Italian forces westward across North Africa. For German generals, however, the battle remained a lesson in humility. They saw clearly that bravery, experience, and tactical skill were not enough to overcome shortages of fuel, artillery, and reinforcements when facing a well-prepared enemy. Even the most seasoned officers had to accept that sometimes strategy, preparation, and resources could decide the outcome as much as courage and daring. Rommel himself remained deeply affected. He had always relied on mobility, surprise, and bold maneuvers to win battles in the desert. At El Alamein, those advantages were neutralized. The British had taken advantage of terrain, supply lines, and careful planning to create a battlefield where traditional desert tactics could no longer dominate. For the Desert Fox, it was a clear indication that even the most talented commanders could be constrained by circumstance. In the years that followed, German generals and historians analyzed El Alamein repeatedly.
Many recognized that it was not just a military defeat, but a turning point in the entire North African campaign. It demonstrated the importance of logistics, preparation, and coordinated action. It showed that patience and methodical planning could overcome even the most skilled opponents. The lessons of El Alamein endured beyond the desert. Generals who survived the campaign carried the experience into later battles, understanding that an enemy's strength could no longer be measured simply by boldness or audacity. Strategy, endurance, and preparation mattered just as much as courage. And in the end, the German generals remembered not only the losses and retreat, but also the professionalism of their enemy and the resilience of their own troops. The battle had tested every officer, soldier, and commander to the limit. For Rommel and his men, it was a bitter defeat, but it was also a lesson in the realities of modern warfare, where victory was never guaranteed, and even the desert fox could be forced to retreat.